Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say in every song. If it's true, that's where I belong.
I want to welcome everybody to the October 8th meeting of the Pacifica Technology Task Force. This is also a joint production with Noisy Reality, which is an independent production company. And we're very pleased today to have Marc Fisher on to talk about his path-breaking book on FM radio and radio in general, Something in the Air, Radio, Rock, and the Revolution That Shaped a Generation. Marc is a senior editor of the Washington Post. He has been the enterprise editor, local columnist, and Berlin bureau chief, among other positions, over 30 years at the newspaper. Marc has written several articles that won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2016 and the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2014. Marc has written previously the Post local column and a blog called Raw Fisher. Earlier, he was the paper's special reports editor, wrote about politics and culture for the Style section, served as Central European bureau chief on the Post foreign staff, and covered D.C. schools and D.C. politics for the Metro section. His history of radio was published in 2007, Something in the Air. He's also written books on the whole question of Germany, After the Wall, Germany, the Germans, and the Burdens of History, published by Simon & Schuster in 1995. He has served as a professor and visiting scholar at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. He also was Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. And Marc, we're very happy to have you here today to talk about your great book, Something in the Air. Thanks for taking time today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well, first of all, let me start with the present. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend 15, 20 minutes talking with Marc, and then we're going to open up to everybody. You finished your book in the 2007 period. So we've had about almost 20 years of change in media and FM radio and all sorts of ways to look at broadcasting, digitization, the growth of podcasting, the question of looking at radios as platforms, as not simply analog radio stations. And I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts about, before we get into the substance of your history, what you think is going on in the past 15 years. If you were going to write this book today, what kind of thoughts do you have about what's transpired in the 20 years with FM radio in particular, and how that interacts with media in general?
Well, this has been a period of enormous change and rapid change. And as a result, we've seen what's happened in media many times before, which is that new technology comes along and the old forms of communication have to adapt or die. And so I think it's fair to say that with the rise of everything from podcasting, satellite radio, internet radio, all of the different kinds of audio that people now use in their lives on a day-to-day basis, listening as they go in their cars, in their earbuds, that is an enormous change in how people listen. And it is, I think, fair to say that radio has not reacted well, has not adapted well. We've seen this before in the history of media, where the old media failed to adapt, failed to take on some of the new roles that required. So what happened in this case, what's happened in the last 15, 20 years is that radio didn't get on board with all of these technological changes quickly enough and hasn't done so fully enough. And so you see in commercial radio, the large radio companies are struggling to survive. Individual stations have either gone out of business or gone to a completely canned kind of format that doesn't cost them any money. And in non-profit radio, we've seen an attempt to adapt to the new technology through the use of podcasts, through the use of all kinds of technology. But it hasn't replaced broadcasting to nearly the extent that it should have. So in general, I think radio gets somewhere between a C- and an F in its ability so far to adapt. That said, there are some podcasts that come from big commercial radio companies, from National Public Radio, from smaller individual public radio stations across the country that do quite well. So there are individual creators who are adapting very well, but I think the larger entities in radio have really fallen behind, and some of them will not survive as a result.
All right. And we're talking with Marc Fisher, who's the author of Something in the Air. This is a history of radio, rock, and the revolution that shaped a generation. Now, Marc, let's go back to some of the issues you talk about in your book. Let's talk about, and if you could share with us, the impact of the introduction of the top 40 formats in terms of how that influences media in the 50s, particularly the influence of Todd Stort's. But also what's interesting in your book is you talk about the evolution of technology, the fact that car radios are really a low percentage of radios in cars in the, let's say, 1950, and also the introduction of transistor radios, which we know revolutionized everything. So just give us a sense of that whole phenomenon, and particularly the top 40 phenomena.
Sure. Going back to what historians call the golden age of radio, this is the pre-television period of radio. Radio was the primary broadcasting medium in the United States and around the world. It was how people got their news, how people got their entertainment, how people really connected with their communities. It was the whole game. Then along came TV and the really reaching mass levels of adoption in the early 1950s. And for the big radio companies, the networks we now think of as TV networks, they were then radio networks, they looked at what was going on and they said, let's go whole hog into television. And so literally the talent that put together all of those different programs, from soap operas to comedies to newscasts, walked out of the radio studio door and into the television studio door. And the networks continued broadcasting on the radio, but really paying very little attention to it. So meanwhile, there are thousands of radio stations across the country owned by mom and pops and that may be affiliated with these big networks, but not owned by them. They're little businesses, and their programming just walked away. Whether it was Bob Hope or Jack Benny or Edward Morrow, they all moved from radio to TV. So on these little radio stations across the country, there's suddenly an enormous programming gap. What do? Well, in Oklahoma, we saw the beginning of the innovation that came not from New York and Los Angeles, but the innovation that came from the middle of the country, from these desperate local radio station owners. And what they did was they invented a new kind of radio. They realized that the big entertainment shows were going to be on TV, not radio. And so instead, they decided we need new formats, new ways of connecting with our communities. They became very local in their orientation, in the kind of news they covered. They started doing traffic reports. They started emphasizing weather reports more consistently. And they started producing local music programming, which became known from this innovator, Todd Stortz, in Oklahoma. He created Top 40 Radio. He did it because he saw the waitresses at his local diner every night when he was there, as they were closing up because he was waiting for his sweetheart, who was a waitress there. And he noticed that the waitresses had a habit of plunking their nickels into the jukebox to hear the same 2 or 3 songs over and over again. So he realized that it was the hits that mattered, and that it wasn't a question. In those days, it was not only not traditional, it was not permitted to play the same songs many times a day, many times a week. There were union regulations that required that your music be played by live bands, by live musicians, and there were restrictions on the number of times you could play one tune in a given day or week. Todd Stortz threw all of that out the window and said, we're going to play records, and we're going to play them frequently based on what people want. Seems totally obvious to us today, but at the time it was revolutionary. And he developed what became known as Top 40 Radio, the top 40 hits that were popular in his community, which his station played over and over again, along with DJs providing all sorts of local news, information, and entertainment. And that became really the format that saved then AM radio and later FM radio a couple of decades later. So really it was an adaptation that local station owners made out of their desperation because they were losing programming. And across the country, radio station owners got wind of what Todd Sturtz was doing in Oklahoma, saw how successful it was in the ratings, in the advertising revenue, the audience size, and they began copying what he was doing. This happened at right around the same time as new technology from Japan came to the United States in the form of transistor radios, pocket radios, literally pocket-sized. This was an enormous change in the mobility of radio and the ability of radio to take on new functions. And so radio went with you everywhere now, not just at home where it had been that piece of furniture in the living room. Well, now television was that piece of furniture in the living room, and radio became something that was portable. The transistor radio, and then later the car radio, allowed radio to transform itself to be an accompaniment in every aspect of people's daily lives. The transistor radio went under the pillow so kids could stay up late at night listening to their favorite music. The transistor radio went to the beach so people could dance at the beach and hang out together and share their versions of what the most popular songs should be. And the car radio, which had been invented a few years earlier, really came into its own in the late 50s, early 60s. That's when car radios became kind of the core of American pop culture, because that's where kids were when they were getting away from home. They were getting out in the car, teenagers at night, and they were listening to the big, powerful 50,000 watt stations that carried their favorite music and their most favored DJs as well. And so this is all on AM radio. This is across the country, enormously powerful radio stations like WABC in New York, like the big stations in Chicago and Los Angeles, and the pirate radio stations in Mexico that Wolfman Jack and later Don Imus were DJs on, sending the hits across the country. So this was happening through transistor radios and then through car radios on AM radio, transforming the ability of AM radio to reach people at work, in the car, on their commute, and at the beach, in every place imaginable, at the ballpark where people would listen to Vin Scully and other sportscasters narrating the game that they were watching with their own eyes. Really a change, an enormous change in popular culture as a result of that transistor technology imported from Japan.
Now, one of the things you talk about in several chapters is the introduction of R&B, African-American music, the whole impact of rock and roll. I found it very insightful to see that the Plagola scandals of the late 50s and into the 60s were interrelated to an aversion to rock and roll music, and essentially an attack on rock and roll music, which you discuss. And I was wondering if you could just share with us your insights into how African-American music, race records, all that, how that sort of factors into this picture in the 50s.
Starting in the late 1940s, there was this phenomenon of race records, which were essentially music by and for Black people. And these records, the early sounds of R&B, the first glimmerings of what we would later call soul music, became very popular, certainly in Black communities. But since it was on the radio on Black run, although often not Black owned stations, these radio stations, which tended to be on the upper end of the AM dial, on the less powerful stations where there was more static and lower power. So this was kind of the back of the bus as far as the radio AM broadcast band went. But nonetheless, there were these voices in most cities of any decent size that were oriented toward a Black audience. However, the music was so popular, the music was so attractive that it quickly drew not just a Black audience, it drew a large white audience as well. And some savvy white DJs picked up on this and realized that they could really boost their ratings by playing some of what were then called race records. Now, on some stations that was not allowed because there was strict segregation about who was played on the radio. But from early on, there was an openness to having Black voices, Black singers, Black bands on the radio. And these DJs who realized how popular early R&B music was started playing these records. Alan Freed in Cleveland is the classic example. He would hold these big dance-a-thons and dance parties that drew thousands of people. And initially, it was a very mixed crowd of blacks and whites, which led to a large police presence and a considerable pushback from some parents of the kids who went to these music events, who didn't want their kids going to a racially mixed event. So this became very controversial. And all of this hooked in at this is the mid-1950s, during McCarthyism, during the Senate hearings on Joseph McCarthy's hunt for phantom communists in the United States government. And that connected with what was happening on the radio and in the pop culture because, as you mentioned, of payola. Payola was the practice where record promoters paid DJs and radio stations to play their records, to their favored records, and to pretend that these were the most popular songs in the country or in that town, when in fact some of them were not popular at all, but they were being played on the radio and repeatedly played and became popular in many cases because of that repetition that was paid for under the table by the record promoters and the record companies. This became a big scandal in the industry when some folks in Congress thought they could get some very favorable publicity by blowing up this scandal and bringing it out in some confrontational congressional hearings, right around the same time that the McCarthy hearings were going on. And so this all became part of an effort to somehow cleanse the culture. This is at the same time, roughly, as when Congress was going after what they saw as immoral storylines in comic books. And there were congressional hearings about that as well. So you see across the culture this effort to rein things in, to prevent race mixing, to prevent a kind of wildness of culture that many whites were afraid of. And so all of this comes together in the mid to late 50s. As a result, the more Congress and parent groups rallied against this music, the more popular it became, obviously, because teenagers certainly want to rebel and certainly want to embrace great music that happens to be very unpopular with their adult peers, with their adult parents and other teachers and so on. And so you really saw a kind of culture war in the modern term that was going on around radio, around music, and particularly around the role that race played in what had been a very segregated part of America's entertainment industry.
Now, one of the things you talk about here is the actual growth of ownership of FM radios. That in 1960, there were 6 million FM radios owned, and then by 1970, there are 93 million. And also, importantly, is the FCC deciding to change the rules about how stations were simulcasting their AM signals, their AM content with FM content. They basically said in 1965 that they had to separate that out, that they had to have original programming on the FM radio dial. Very significant fact that some of us forget. Now, with those facts being stated, I'd like you to talk about what you think are the impacts of the introduction of alternative forms of media, such as Gene Shepard and such as Pacifica Radio. For example, you talk about Bob Fest, you talk about Gene Shepard, and all of us here, there's many of us here who have been influenced by those folks, and I'm just curious, and you yourself, as a young man, came and worked at WBAI for a while. I guess you were at the church in the 70s,
right,
before you went to college down in Princeton. So I'm just curious, that part of it, how does that affect this whole discussion about the revolution of FM radio?
Yeah, we've been talking up until now almost exclusively about AM radio. AM radio was radio to most Americans from the 1920s well into the 1960s. It's really, FM radio was introduced in the 40s, but really was the province of a very high-end, high-fidelity kind of listeners who were into that cleaner, smoother sound of FM radio. But most people didn't have FM radios well into the 1960s, only people who were really into hi-fi. What changed everything was the introduction of FM radios into cars as standard equipment. That happens about 1965. So it's really only beginning in 1965 that most Americans start tuning in. Hey, what's going on FM radio? And wow, that's a cleaner sound. There's no static. People liked it. And what radio stations were doing at that time was playing the same material that they had on their AM station on their FM station. And they just simulcasted. And the FCC and a number of people in the industry said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And now that people are shifting over to FM radio, we ought to give them a choice. We ought to give them something different, because we can make more money if we provide different kinds of programming and bring in a different kind of audience. And so tremendous pressure was put on the FCC, which then said, you cannot simulcast. You cannot have the same program on your AM station and your FM station. If we're going to give you a license for an FM station, you need to use it for something else. So FM became the place of experimentation, the place where niche formats developed. No longer was it radio just about reaching the broadest possible audience with top 40 music or with news. Rather, it was the place where niche interests could be catered to. So in New York, you had WABC AM playing top 40 and WABC FM playing Broadway show tunes. You had WCBS AM was all news, and WCBS FM played oldies music. And on, up and down the dial, there were lots of new formats. That open FM dial was also a grand opportunity for a nonprofit companies and groups and churches and so on, to educational organizations to come forward and get licenses and provide the kinds of programming that was unlikely to ever make money. So classical music, poetry, spoken word. WBAI was a pioneer in this. The early Pacifica broadcast content was really a very high-end intellectual mix. There was poetry, there were play readings, there was very sophisticated political discussion. There were Cap Weinberger, later the Secretary of Defense under Nixon, had a show on WBAI. So there were conservatives as well as liberals, as well as leftists. It was really the whole political spectrum was represented, and there were a lot of debates across that spectrum. The founders of Pacifica wanted that kind of intellectual and political fervor. They wanted that kind of debate and exchange. And this was happening in a number of cities across the country. And so there was also a kind of artistic, new kind of expression on the radio that stemmed from the experiments that happened on WOR in New York, where Gene Shepard, with his all-night talk show, would spin out stories with no script, not even any notes, simply riffing in this very improvisational way all night long. Long John Nebel, the all-night talk show host, also for a time on WOR, later on WMCA, would kind of open up people's minds. Today, we would perhaps call a lot of his content misinformation, but at the time, it was where fringe ideas about UFOs, about conspiracy theories, about the Kennedy assassination, all kinds of theories and ideas and arguments that were not really heard on the mainstream networks had their place overnight on these experimental talk shows that very much reflected the individual personalities of these hosts. And that happened both on commercial radio and on non-commercial radio. And that idea of this sort of free-form radio that Gene Shepard largely invented was really adopted by a number of folks on public stations, on nonprofit stations, including Pacifica stations, by Bob Fass, by Steve Post, by Larry Josephson at WBAI, and by similar voices across the country, particularly in large cities, but really in many corners of the country as well.
Now, there's another element. I'm now going to turn it over to other folks for their comments and questions. Somebody, Michael Heitz, mentioned in the chat that I should mention, of course, Larry Josephson and Steve Post on BAI. Gene Shepard, of course, had a tremendous impact, but the FM revolution was quite profound. you had simply look at you described the amazing experiments in San Francisco with Kaufman radio, which I used to love to listen to. I thought that was the best rock and roll station I ever heard. People forget that WBLS, when they came on the air, they were basically playing R&B nonstop without commercials. And then you have, of course, the formation of NPR. I know some people in Pacifica tend to poo-poo what's been transformed, but Bill Simmering was visionary. When he was up in Buffalo creating his station, it was essentially an amazing story. And so before I turn it to other people, just, and again, it's a rich book. We're talking with Marc Fisher, who's the author of Something in the Air. It's a history of radio rock and the revolution that shaped a generation. Just share with us some of the great, amazing things that happened with the FM revolution, which in your mind is essentially over by the early 70s, or it's changed. It's changed. It's not the same situation. But Tom Donahue, Kaufman, Simmering, just share with us your insights into those people.
Sure. Because the FM band was literally wide open, and there were many unclaimed frequencies in those early years, and lots of different groups applied for licenses or took over licenses of existing stations, and it was there wasn't a lot of money coming in to the commercial stations because there wasn't a big audience yet, and the non-commercial stations we're also in that same position of needing a lot of content, needing a lot of programming, all of a sudden, not having a lot of money to pay for it. And so commercial and non-commercial stations alike opened their doors to people who had ideas and wanted to try things out. At the University of Buffalo in upstate New York, a guy named Bill Simmering was in charge of the university radio station, and he wanted to open up that station, make it a real voice of the community. And so he began with a number of talk shows about local issues. He wanted all aspects of the community to be represented. So he opened up storefront studios in Black neighborhoods of Buffalo and recruited local people to come in and invent their own programming, invent the kinds of shows they wanted for their community. Similarly with the folks at the university, he asked them to come in and create what they wanted. And so you had this melange of wildly different programming on one station, which was something that was new in radio at that point. Obviously, in the early days of radio, there was a different kind of program every half hour that the networks provided, but that was those all fit within standard categories of entertainment: soap operas, situation comedies, discussion shows, and so on. This was something much more experimental, and so Simmering wanted to have all the voices that didn't make their way into the mainstream media be available for people to come together and to produce on their own. And so he created in those storefront studios classrooms where people could come in and learn the craft of radio, where they could, it was do-it-yourself radio very much from the beginning. And other university stations around the country copied this to one extent or another. Simmering was the real pioneer. At Buffalo, one of his pioneering programmers was a young student named Terry Gross, who would go on to invent and for many years maintain the public radio show Fresh Air. A lot of other very creative public radio people came out of that Buffalo scene, and Simmering himself became kind of the Pied Piper of very open, free-form public radio, and took that model nationwide when the federal government decided to create what was then the radio version of National Educational Television, which had been around for a few years. And so as educational radio, the precursor of NPR, Simmering came to Washington and tried to create that same sensibility, that same openness, that same eagerness to have all communities reflected on the radio. And so if you go back and listen to those first years of educational radio and then of national public radio, you hear a very rough sound, not the clean corporate sound that NPR evolved into, but rather a rough sound of people who were not accustomed to being on the radio, did not have a lot of professional experience, but wanted their voices heard, wanted their stories told, and took it upon themselves to do so. And even as they began the very first nationwide news programming on NPR. The first, it's fascinating to go back and listen to those first months of All Things Considered, where you hear people like Robert Siegel, who came from WRVR in New York, which was owned by the Riverside Church and was very much a voice of jazz and community news in New York City. He brought that community news mentality to NPR, those early days. And so you heard very experimental newscasts where a story might go on for 30, 40, 50 minutes, where there were live interviews on the street with people, where microphones were handed over to demonstrators at all kinds of political events. So it was a very wide open, y'all come kind of approach that got smoothed out and papered over the course of the years as it was professionalized, as the urgent need came along to raise money and win subscribers. But in those early years, it was very much a free-form endeavor.
Yeah, and of course, the first NPR broadcast is covering the May Day demonstrations in 1971 in Washington. I just wanted you to, before we start to take the questions, just talk about your feelings about how KSON and all these other experimental rock and roll stations are in this picture.
From the very beginning of FM radio, there was, as I said, this enormous need to fill time, to get some programming. And in San Francisco, there was a guy named Tom Donahue, along with his wife, Rachel. And Tom Donahue was a shouting, mellow-voiced, deep-voiced, rather, AM top 40 DJ. And he played the hits, and he hated it. He didn't like the music. He didn't like the personality that he'd been saddled with or assigned to by his station. He was a very popular top 40 DJ on a big AM station in San Francisco, but he went home at night and he didn't listen to any of that teeny bopper stuff. He listened to album cuts. He listened to the emerging rock and roll of the late 60s on his record player. And he bemoaned the fact that he couldn't play that stuff on the radio. There was nowhere on the radio to play that stuff. And then along came this opening of FM radio, and there was in San Francisco a spoken word station, a foreign language station. It was one of these kinds of stations that rented out time by half an hour, by an hour, to all the different immigrant groups in town so they could have their show, the Greek hour, the Polish hour, the Chinese hour, the Korean hour, and so on. And that's how the station made its money. It rented time to each of these groups, and they came in and did their own programming in their own language. Well, those folks wanted to have the prime hours during the day and the early evening, but nobody wanted to run those shows or pay for them overnight because they figured nobody would be listening. So the station had all these empty hours in the middle of the night. Tom Donahue was looking desperately for a place to play those rock records, and he literally went through the yellow pages calling radio stations, happened upon this foreign language station, called up, and they said, well, you can buy our overnight hours if you want them. And he said, sold. And he went down to KSAN and brought his record collection with him, a box of records every night, and started playing the rock and roll music that he and his friends listened to in his apartment. And it was an enormous, immediate hit. He started getting phone calls from people saying, hey, do you know the new Cream album is out, or the new Procol Harum is out, whatever it was. And he would play the requests. They would talk about the music on the air with listeners. It was a real community that developed very quickly. He had an open door policy. People would come down to the station. They would get high with him. They would bring their records for him to play. It was a community that developed in the nighttime on KSAN and developed into what became the model for underground radio in many cities across the country on FM.
All right, thank you. And we're talking with Marc Fisher, who's the author of Something in the Air, Radio Rock and the Revolution That Shaped a Generation. Let's bring on folks to ask comments and questions. Let's start with Jim Sagurton. Jim, you just have to unmute.
Hi, thanks, Jim. Hi, Mark. Pleasure to meet you. Very interesting to hear that you once worked at WBAI. You're kind of describing, my life, although I didn't know all the background about it. In 1965, when transistor radios were coming in, I was under the covers listening to Gene Shepard, sometimes with a flashlight reading a book, but listening to Gene Shepard too. But I thought I had no idea that was a brand new phenomenon. So just very interesting to hear you put a lot of this stuff into context. You said something very interesting to me, because we have at Pacifica a legend, and particularly at WBAI, a legend, but perhaps a myth, maybe you can clear it up, that Bob Fass invented freeform radio. But I just heard you say Gene Shepard invented freeform radio. And I just wonder if there are any distinctions in there. For example, Bob Fass heavily relied on call-ins, phone calls, and I don't recall Gene Shepard having call-ins. So just talk about that a little more.
Sure, it's a great question, and it's really, it comes down to, as these things often do, it comes down to definitions, right? So no one in the early years of Gene Shepard's show ever called it freeform. That just, the term didn't exist. Looking back, we can say he was the root of what became freeform radio, in that he had his allotted time on the air. He went on having no plan. He just riffed. It was an improvisational art form. So we can see in that the roots of what became freeform radio. Although the folks at WOR, where he worked, would not have called it that. And they insisted that he hit his ad breaks at the right minutes, and he would always weave his General Tire ads into whatever story he was telling. And you would think you'd be going down some weird channel of his story, and all of a sudden you'd realize that the last 3 minutes were just a lead-in for the next General Tire ad. So he was playing with and pushing at the edges of the very tight formats of commercial radio. And so people like Bob Fass and Steve Post saw Shepard as a mentor, as a model, as an inspiration. But really it was, you're absolutely right, the myth of Bob Fass is true to a very large extent. And that myth is indeed the birth of freeform radio in its fullest flowering. There are others around the country who lay claim to being the inventor of freeform radio. There was an all-night guy in Detroit who was doing it right around the same time. Fass himself had modeled some of what he did on a show that was on in Berkeley and another one that was on in Los Angeles. So right around that same time in the early 60s, there were a bunch of people in different cities, and of course no internet, so they weren't hearing each other except maybe in a tape that was made off the radio and sent in the mail that somebody listened to, or somebody on a trip heard one of these shows. Most of what Fass did, he invented himself. And he had Shepard in the back of his mind, but he also had the experimental theater of Greenwich Village in his mind, because he had been an actor in Three Penny Opera and in some other productions down in the Village in the early 60s before he came to BAI. And so as an actor who was very much schooled in that improvisational technique, and as someone who wanted to get his culture across on the radio, and as someone who was a true night owl, who was into the whole suggestiveness and susceptibility that the audience has to new and different ideas and scary and cosmological weirdnesses of the night, he latched onto all of that. And just because he was also kind of a mess of a guy and not organized, he took those all-night hours and played with them as if they were his own orchestra, and he was the conductor, and he just let things go. So he would not just take calls, he would take multiple calls at the same time, and he would hear one interesting thing from one caller, another from another, and he would say, "Talk among yourselves." And he'd sit back, or he'd go to John, or he'd light up a joint, and he'd let the callers talk to each other for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. People would wander in off the street, including folks like Bob Dylan and Arlo Guthrie, and they just wander into the studio and jam and riff with Bob. And so there was no format. It was truly freeform in a way that Gene Shepard couldn't have imagined. And so if you're looking for the absolute definition of who invented freeform, my vote would be for Fass, but my vote would also be to give Shepard the credit for inspiring a whole bunch of such people across the country.
Thank you for that. I just want to say, phew, you pulled that one out of the fire for us.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Michael, go on, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Mark, for a very interesting discussion. I can attest to Shepard because for 2 summers I produced Barry Farber's overnight show at WOR, and Shepard was on from 10:15 to 11:15 before us. And you could say it's freeform, but he was very precise. And he had one guy who was his board op, as we'd say now. And there was no deviation. It was organized disorganization. And he never took phone calls, for sure, not even when he did his overnight show. But I wanted to ask you another question. As you can see from my background here, I'm sort of into old radio stuff as well. But as a print person, do you draw any parallels between all the problems that the print media are encountering now in terms of localization versus, going out of business, to what's happening with radio? But in that middle period between the demise of Mutual, ABC, Red, Blue, CBS, and where we are today, 2 things I would point to are the rise of syndication and formatted radio. And I think particularly of the original WOR-FM after they duopoly had to, force them to take the separate programming. They were an original freeform programming. And then the management went to the Drake format, which was very successful and spread all over the country. And the ORAM people, Roscoe and whatever, went over to WNEW-FM. But the question is, syndication to some extent has taken the place of what the big networks used to do. And on the one hand, gave rise to Limbaugh and all of that stuff. But at the other hand, if Nebel was alive today, his counterpart in syndication would later have been Art Bell and George Noory, so that feeds overnight radio in a different way. So I guess that's sort of a rambling way. It's early in the morning.
That's right.
Yes, sorry about that. But your take on the parallels between the issues confronting a local print media and the impact of, on the one hand, everybody wanted to get Johnny Mann singers and the Drake jingles. And then syndication, the iHearts and the Westwood ones and all of those guys, Premier, the impact of that on local radio is still local stations, but local stations aren't local, if any of that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and you raise a really important point that has a lot to do not only with the shape and content of radio and television these days, but also with our politics. There has been a consistent war, a real tension throughout the history of broadcasting between the local and the national. And as you mentioned, back in the so-called golden era, it was primarily national programming from Mutual and ABC and NBC and CBS that went out to all these local stations across the country. So everybody listened to Benny Goodman, and everybody listened to Jack Benny, and everybody listened to essentially the same shows across the country. There wasn't a lot of local content. Baseball games were local, and there were some local music shows, but not much. And then along came television, and television forced radio to go local. And that lasted for quite some time. But then technology allowed radio to go back to national. When satellites came along, it became cheaper for a radio station to just pick up the signal and a, quote, more professional sound from the syndicator in New York or Los Angeles than to have its own local staff and local programming. And so we saw the pendulum swing back toward national programming. And as you mentioned, the Rush Limbaugh, an early pioneer in taking a local talk show and turning it into a national one. Same thing with Howard Stern. These were the early stars of satellite radio. We saw exactly the same thing happening on television when cable came along, and that allowed for a nationalization of the content of television. And so you went from local shows of in New York, a David Susskind or a Morton Downey on doing talk shows locally. And that became the big national talk shows that are now essentially the cable news channels. So you see the same tension between local and national, the pendulum swinging back and forth, and then along comes the internet, which solidifies that nationalization of the entire culture. And so you really lose a tremendous amount of local identity, not only in broadcasting, but as you mentioned, in print, and in every aspect of our culture. And so you see the impact on local retailing, on local organizations, social organizations, political organizations. The whole culture gets nationalized as social media comes along and people find their like-minded folks, their affinity groups across the country, and they identify with each other by those interests rather than by where they live. That has had a tremendous impact on bringing people together around those interests, and an even larger impact on dividing us politically and socially and culturally because of that nationalization of the culture and the loss of those local connections that required us to get along, to some extent at least, with the other folks who live in our own communities. So a long way of saying that there's this yin yang between local and national. It's happened in broadcasting. It's happened in the culture writ large. In the print journalism field that I'm so familiar with, we've seen it again and again, where since the advent of the internet, most local publications have suffered dearly, if not closed entirely, and those publications that are still thriving are big national ones that can attract a large national audience and try to make money that way. But the local model, the local business model, has been tremendously damaged, if not utterly destroyed, in most of these fields.
And one thing before I bring Alex on is interesting is that I'm thinking about the growth of community radio that's influenced by Pacifica. And in your book, you talk about by the mid-'70s, the amount of underground radio stations has declined from 300 to a couple of dozen. And then we have the transition to the top show jock refugees from the top 40 formats gravitate to the talk formats such as Rush Limbaugh, which then becomes the angry white man dominating our culture now ever since. Alex, go on.
Yes. So I want to ask about one of your later chapters where you get to this kind of ridiculous focus group format that they've kind of, developed now to go away from top 40, and like just the idea of like having people listen to like a 7-second clip of a song and, clicking on the dials and that to determine what songs a station is going to play just seems, just nonsensical. So I'm wondering, has that basically continued? Has it gotten worse? And also, when you were writing, you were talking about the beginnings of like Sirius XFM. So I wonder, also what you think about how that's continued to shift in terms of technology in radio, and
Sure. What you're talking about is a chapter in the book where I went along with some of the consultants who were doing the programming for a number of rock and radio stations, and the way they pick their music then, and to a lesser extent now, what's called mall testing. And mall testing, they're essentially focus groups. They pay people $50 or $100 and they say, we'd like you to listen to a whole bunch of music and just tell us what you think of it. And they bring 20, 30 people into a big room in a mall or an office building somewhere. They give them food, they give them some sodas, they sit them down, put headphones on them, and then they play, as you said, anywhere from 4 to 8 second clips of songs, and it's the hook of each song. It's the little that pulls you in, and people have a dial in their hand, and they spin that dial up if they like the song and down if they don't, and all of that feeds into a computer, and it results in score for each song, and that score determines what gets played on that radio station, whether that song is dumped from the format, is added to the format, is allowed to stay, but maybe is played more frequently or less frequently. A lot of this kind of testing has migrated online these days, but it's the exact same process, and it's how almost all music choices are made on the radio. It's not just music, by the way. The same technology, the same approach is used to determine what topics are going to be on talk radio, on talk television, Fox, MSNBC, those kinds of channels. They're always testing topics as well. Do we want to emphasize abortion? Is that what people are going to really stick around and watch? Maybe is it immigration? So they test topics for discussion, just like they test the latest songs from the various top 40 groups. So it's the same way McDonald's decides which products to have on the menu. It's the same way all kinds of choices are made in all sorts of retail settings about what products to put near the front door and which ones are the end caps at the front of each aisle of the supermarket. And it's how those choices have been made for decades in our culture. And that radio is in many ways a pioneer in figuring out that technology. The technology has changed a little bit, but it's essentially the same process.
All right, Ken. Go on, Kenny. You have to unmute, Ken. You have to unmute. You're still muted.
On mute. Sorry. Pin. Okay. So, Mark, fantastic presentation. I just wanted to ask you, you did cover this to a degree, but the medium is the message from Marshall McLuhan. That's his basic concept, that it's sometimes or possibly more influential how you're communicating than what's being communicated. And I guess it all started with people seeing live performances, then went to dictaphones and record players, and we have a range now from an in-person concert with 50,000 people, large screens and speakers, TVs, movies, television, radios, handheld phones, and maybe you might be listening on your watch, or if Mark Zuckerberg will have his way, you'll be listening to it in the meta universe. How much of the market, I don't mean the market, I mean the phenomena of distributing content is currently influenced by the medium, considering we have now the ubiquitous internet, and anybody can listen to anything from anywhere, and anybody can talk to everybody.
Right. Exactly right. And that is an enormous change. So most of what we've been talking about today is the old traditional notion of broadcasting, one to many. And that model has been turned on its head by the recent technological changes, from the internet to World Wide Web and on to social media and podcasting. Podcasting is really more along the lines of what we've been talking about. It's one to many. It's a one-way communication, and it's really radio delivered through a different methodology. It's an example of how radio dropped the ball, because radio companies and radio stations and radio creators should have been the creative people behind podcasting, and some of them were, but a lot of them really dropped the ball. What's different, what's changed, what has altered the nature of communication and therefore of our economy and our politics is the way in which social media allows, as you say, everyone to be a broadcaster, everyone to have their voice. And so whether it's YouTube or Reddit or any number of social media platforms, everyone has the ability to have their own show, to have their own say. And as a result, that has undermined the authority and the reach of traditional broadcasters. And we see that in declining ratings across all media. We see that in enormous increases in mistrust of media of all kinds, whether it be broadcast, print, or internet. So as people realize, hey, I can do this too, or why isn't my voice precisely as important and authoritative as the next person's, you see this undermining of trust and undermining of authority that leaves people wondering, who am I supposed to believe? Who should I listen to and who should I believe? And we see, of course, every day in our politics, the immediate result of that, which is misinformation, disinformation, a loss of a common foundation of facts. I had an old editor when I first came to the Washington Post who said, every reader deserves one clean crack at the facts. Before you get into your interpretation or before you get into any kind of commentary, let's give people the facts first. We've lost that sensibility in our culture to a frightening degree. And our instinct now is, because of this proliferation of voices and the lack of any way of filtering those voices, we now have a cacophony of voices. And we don't know whom to trust. We don't know whom to believe. It's an enormous social and political problem, and one that will not be easily solved because you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Everyone has that access, and that's going to continue to be the case.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up just briefly?
Go on.
This might not be of significance, but the early, what you call freeform radio, was a stream of consciousness that we all fell in love with. I particularly stuck on the Fire Sign Theater over and over, May I See Your Passport and all of that. But do you think, and I consider that the current rage with TikTok and YouTube's following with their small YouTube, where you just get short attention span, 90 seconds of somebody doing their best to capture your attention. And then it will go to the next thing, and it's kind of monitored so that you get things that you would want or your identity would want. If you've been identified as a blue-collar worker, they'll say, well, he'll want beer commercials or whatever their logic is. Do you see anything like that in broadcast radio where a short format could be used to give short, for the purpose of short attention spans, other than shock jocks?
I think in all aspects of media these days, people are looking for ways to cater to the ever shorter attention span, to cater to the habit that people have of flipping around. People, since the invention of the remote control, Americans have been channel flippers and station flippers, but now we have that on steroids. And so we have the ability to flick from one thing to the next after 1 or 2 seconds, and people use that ability. So a lot of companies and creators are trying to cater to that. The result is a lot of crap that's out there, as well as the occasional interesting experiment. But you see every major media outlet in the country jumping onto TikTok and trying to produce their own extremely short form products, and sometimes they do well, but they rarely do well as some random kid in his bedroom somewhere. So it's these are all experiments. It's very much akin to that early days of FM that we were talking about earlier, where we're seeing 1,000 flowers blooming and also 1,000 flowers dying and getting mowed under, because most of what's out there is not very good. And what we're missing is the filters, the limits that broadcasting provided in the past. So there were a limited number of FM frequencies, and so people competed to get those frequencies or to succeed on those frequencies so they could keep them. And that winnowed the programming so that you had to have something at least vaguely attractive to people in order to survive. That's no longer true. You can produce the worst possible stuff and throw it online, and maybe no one will listen to it, but maybe somebody will, but there's nothing weeding it out. And that's why we have a culture of confusion, and that's why we have a culture that seems without a foundation. No one would choose to go back to the days of 3 television networks and 1 monopoly newspaper in each city. That seems woefully constricting to us today. But the benefit of that period was that choices were being made collectively by all of us, by what we watched and listened to, that allowed us to share a certain foundation. And so we could then have our debates and our disagreements based on that foundation. Now we don't have a foundation, and we disagree even about the facts. And that is dangerous for us as a society, because we each end up in our own silos saying, oh, here are the people I believe. And the other guy said, oh, there are the people I believe. And there's nothing in common between them. Very hard to make progress and reach compromise when there's no point of connection.
Well, thank you.
Yes, very true. Please raise your hands if you have comments or questions. I know Julie wants to jump in there. One thing that I think is important to put into the mix here is, and this is you discuss in the book, is the whole question of how internet radio got essentially derailed back in 2002 when the Library of Congress, under pressure from commercial broadcasters, issued new rules requiring internet stations to pay royalties to music publishing cooperatives like ASCAP and BMI. And even in the midst of all this, you still have the thrust for setting up low-power FM stations in Brooklyn. There are over 30 pirate radio stations right now. So I'm wondering your thoughts, because I'd like to, hear some of your ideas about the kind of things we could apply to the dilemmas of Pacifica right now. Is there indeed on Capitol Hill a progressive lobbying effort that has to do with radio? What are your thoughts about doing that? I mean, essentially taking some of the ideas you have here and trying to apply them in terms of influencing policy on the part of congressmen and senators in the commerce committees of Capitol Hill, which is where essentially the radio stuff is discussed.
Yeah, I mean, 10 or 20 years ago, early days of satellite radio and low-power FM, there was a small explosion of creativity and experimentation. That's before social media really blossomed. That's before a lot of the podcasting revolution took place. So in that interim period, you did see a flowering of a number of technological alternatives that led to programming alternatives. Low power FM is very, very successful in some cities. Where I live in Washington, there's a terrific station in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that has all local people who come into the studio and do all kinds of eclectic music shows as well as political programming. There are lots of places around the country where there are micro successes of low power stations that really are about their community, about their neighborhood. And that I think that is an enduring change. But it kind of, and that change came from a very grassroots kind of movement based with particularly Prometheus Radio Collective in Philadelphia was a major driving force behind that change in the way the FCC thought about allowing those kinds of low power stations. And there were religious groups that were behind that as well. So that is thriving, but it really has been overshadowed by the more recent technological advances, and particularly around podcasting and the ubiquity of podcasting today. That said, only about 35% of Americans have ever listened to a podcast. But of that 35%, they've really adopted it, and in many cases, it has replaced or substantially replaced radio as part of their daily lives. So that's something where the traditional entities and voices of radio are obviously very deeply involved and getting more so, but are still, I think, lagging behind. The real battle, I think, is going to be once again, as it was in the 1950s and 60s, in the car. It is still, even after all these years of having the internet, it's still kind of cumbersome to listen to podcasts and other internet audio in the car. And, we've got Bluetooth and we've got Apple in the car, and there's all kinds of workarounds, and the auto companies have been pretty good about trying to incorporate that into their audio systems. And in some new cars, it's even hard to find the traditional radio. But I think in any month now, we're going to see car companies start producing cars without AM bands in their cars. And that's going to change a lot of people's lives in the radio industry. But I think it's fair to conclude that radio has kind of lost, or is in the process of losing, the battle for people's ears in the car. And that's a tragedy, because radio is just made for the car. So that's a battle that is still unfolding, and one that has lots of opportunity for programmers of any sort, because that car audience is the most captive audience, and audio is what it's all about in the car, and no one has quite mastered it.
Right. Julie Hewitt. Julie, you're unmuted.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah,
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We got you.
Great. My question for Mark, and I sometimes listen to WOWD too, but my question is picking up on that local versus national content trend that you mentioned before. Do you have any thoughts about how Pacifica Network and its affiliates could counter the trend that conservative politicians or conservatives have been good at leveraging in terms of, taking over local elected offices, and then, kind of like having that be the training grounds for people to move up the food chain in terms of politics? Do you have any thoughts about that, and how we might do that without, violating FCC regs? And then just one teeny little question to add on that. Do you think that FM radios are about to be not included in automobiles? Thanks.
Sure. I'll just take the second one first. I don't think there's any danger of FM being removed from cars anytime soon. The FM radio is still, well more than 80% of Americans listen to FM radio every day. And that number is just enormous compared to other media. So it's way beyond the podcast audience, for example. So the FM radio is not going out of cars anytime soon, and I would venture to say not in the coming decades either. It's just that AM radio has been so diminished, and the sound quality is so much worse, and stations are putting so much less effort and energy and investment into the programming, that AM is kind of both dying on the vine and killing itself. But back to your question about how conservative media and conservative politicians have used media to promote their issues and candidates. There is a tremendous bond or connection between early conservative talk radio and talk radio as it developed first locally and then nationally, and the redefinition of the Republican agenda and the way in which the whole conservative movement has shifted. There's a new book out by Nicole Hammer, who argues that that Rush Limbaugh, that the modern Republican Party, which we associate with everyone from Newt Gingrich all the way through Donald Trump, is really created by and formed in the image of Rush Limbaugh and his show. And there's a lot to be said for that. You can track any number of issues that began to be real connecting kinds of issues for Republicans, began on the Limbaugh show, migrated to a number of folks in Congress, and then went on from there to become real wedge issues, cultural war issues across the country. So they really had mastered that art of transforming what's popular on conservative talk radio into what moves voters at the voting booth. And we have not seen a very similar kind of process on the left or in the center. It really has been a conservative right-wing phenomenon. And why is that? Well, one reason is that there is something about the talk radio format that draws individualists and people who are alone in their cars or work on their own, and draws people who have a certain set of grievances and gripes, which talk radio is all about. And so there was this easy, happy marriage between audience and those who were kind of shaping the message and trying to shape a political agenda. On the left is a lot more disparate, as we know, and a lot less. It's a lot less. It's a coalition that's far more difficult to unite, particularly around one or two issues. And so the various attempts at liberal or left talk radio through the years have all failed. Air America was probably the best funded of those. It went nowhere. And part of that is that there are and have been left-wing talk show hosts who were angry and popular, but they tend to be more about entertainment than they are about politics. So a lot of the early morning shock jocks in the 90s were liberals, but they weren't talking about politics. Howard Stern is a great example of someone who I think of as a left libertarian. Most of his social views are left, but he's still an angry guy who fits comfortably stylistically with conservative hosts, even though he's not one himself. So it's just a different kind of entertainment that hasn't lent itself to that kind of transformation into a political movement or agenda. So you asked me for solutions, you asked me for answers, and I gave you all the reasons why there aren't answers. But if I had that goal and wanted to do that kind of programming, I would look for that kind of entertaining figure who doesn't feel the slightest guilt about being funny and ribald and politically incorrect, even as he has a more left-oriented kind of program than those who've been so popular at that on the conservative side.
All right. Thank you. And of course, what Mark is referring to is Nicole Hemmer's book, Partisans, the Conservative Revolutionaries Who Remade American Politics in the 1990s. She also has a book that probably was her dissertation, Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics. Kim, unmute, please. Kim Kaufman.
Hi there. Very interesting discussion. First of all, I want to disagree about Air America. I think, in fact, it was very popular, but it was undercapitalized from the beginning, and that was their problem. And it is somewhat hard to have a broadcast that is criticizing corporate money. Ken, you might want to mute yourself. Corporate money, and then trying to get advertising. So their problem was not popularity, from my understanding of it. But one question: what, in your opinion, or which was more damaging in the creation of right-wing talk radio? The elimination of the Fairness Doctrine by Reagan, or Bill Clinton's 1994 Telecommunications Act, which gave license for the consolidation and the elimination of all the independent radio stations around the country, and led us where we are now. So, thank you.
Yep. Sure. That's a really interesting question. Just on Air America, I think some of their shows were artistic successes, but none of them were audience successes. I don't know of a single city in the country.
Not true.
I don't know
of the documentary. Read the look at the documentary about it.
Find me one city in the country where they ever had more than a 3 rating, because I don't think it exists. And you could argue that they were stuck on some pretty weak frequencies and poor stations. Even in those cities where they were on decent frequencies, they never made any headway with in the ratings. but to your, I'm fascinated by your question about the Fairness Doctrine and the Telecom Act. I actually have always believed that the Fairness Doctrine the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine had very little impact on content, and that the industry had already largely moved beyond the Fairness Doctrine. In other words, they were dancing around it or outright violating it. If you go back to the early days of the Bob Grant Show in New York, or Joe Pine in Los Angeles, some of the early, guts and blood kind of really out there right-wing radio talk show hosts, they were ignoring the Fairness Doctrine well before the Fairness Doctrine was finally lifted. So that was, I think, a case of the law catching up with reality. Big companies like ABC were totally happy to put Rush Limbaugh on their stations well before the Fairness Doctrine allowed them to be as free with a one-sided presentation as they were. And I think the reason it was so easy to lift the Fairness Doctrine in the end was that everybody wanted it to go away, whether they were on the left or the right, whether they were in corporate media or public media, everybody wanted it to go away. Everybody wanted to be able to do their thing. But the Telecom Act, I think, had much more severe impact. First of all, in blessing the extreme concentration of ownership that we saw develop in the mid-90s in the radio industry, and the tone that set for the then very early developing law around the internet. I think that's the most crucial impact. We always think of the Telecom Act in the Clinton administration as it was carte blanche, go on and you big clear channel companies, you can buy every station in town and you can dominate, and you can fire everybody and you can automate everything and get rid of local voices. And here's the government's blessing, go to it. And that did have a tremendously negative impact on community broadcasting, on local connections in communities everywhere in the country. But even beyond that, what that law allowed, it was the kind of thinking that brought us to Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which is what gave the internet companies the ability to put anything they want on their sites and take no responsibility for it whatsoever. And so we at the Washington Post, or you at Pacifica, or anyone who has a broadcast license, anyone who publishes anything in print, we are responsible for our content. And people can sue us, and they can sue us for libel or for slander. And so there are these natural checks and legal checks on our ability to malign someone or to slander someone. Obviously, that doesn't exist online, and that's because there is an exemption in federal law that allows internet companies to say, we have nothing to do with the content, we're just the pipes. And we all see what damage that has done to our culture and to our politics. And, there are voices on both the left and the right that want reform of Section 230. There'll be tremendous battles over exactly how to do that so as not to limit speech. But it clearly, the idea that they had to give absolute carte blanche to internet companies, which at the time they didn't know would grow to be the dominant behemoths that they are today, that was clearly not intended, and we're all dealing with those unintended consequences.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Anita Hawkins, you have to unmute. We're going to start winding down. Anita, you have to hit *6 if you want to ask a question. Anita Hawkins? All right, Mike, go on, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I had to turn off for something else, but something I saw in the other thing that I was looking at just now, I don't know if anybody has heard, but somewhat very pertinent to what Mark has been saying, KGO in San Francisco, which is a major, has been for a gazillion years, talk station, is changing format devoted to sports betting.
Right. Yeah. KGO just signed off last week as longest running news talk station in Northern California after 81 years. And I don't think anyone is going to shed a lot of tears for the loss of what KGO had become.
But what it was.
What it once was is a different story. So a good friend of mine is Chip Franklin, who for many years was a talk show host on KGO, a local talk show host who lived in San Francisco, talked about San Francisco issues, knew the neighborhoods, had people on from all different voices, and KGO was never the perfect radio station. It was a commercial station that trafficked in a lot of in some sensational matters, but it was a local station with local hosts doing local programming. That stopped several years ago, and Chip was sacked along with most of the other talk show hosts, and the station went to essentially an all syndicated format. So they were not doing any local programming to speak of. They were piping in the same national shouters of various political slogans that are on talk stations across the country. So the loss of this KGO is not one that we're going to be mourning. However, you're right. It is a very important symbolic moment, and I think we're going to see this in city after city, where stations that have been cutting away at their news and talk capabilities, their capability of doing any local programming, they're going to be eliminating that entirely and going to either syndicated talk or syndicated music, or in this case, a new format that's starting to pop up around the country that focused on sports betting.
As a follow-up, if I may, and then I got to go back to my other thing, as a parallel to KGO, also owned originally by ABC and Cumulus or whoever the hell they are now, look at KABC here in Los Angeles in its glory days of Michael Jackson and Ray Bream and all of those folks, and you look at what it's become now. What's the over-under and its ratings? I mean, they make KPFK look good, if you will pardon me, folks. What's the over-under on when KABC, I believe a major Clear Channel lowercase station, changes to sports betting, particularly with all the nonsense out here, although they'll both go down with the sports betting initiatives. I don't think they're long for this world.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Let's try to finish it off with Kim. Go on, Kim.
Okay. Just a little follow-up. Thank you for, I agree with you, and I'm glad to hear you agree, supporting my opinion about how bad Bill Clinton's bill was, more than the fairness doctrine. And I didn't really understand how that was tied into the 230 thing. But I just want to talk a little bit more about Air America. I don't have the numbers in front of me, whether there were 3 or 4, 1 or 2 rating. My understanding is in certain markets, they were winning against right-wing, talk shows, number 1. Number 2, you're right, they had crappy signals, crappy stations and all that. Bad economics about it. And more importantly, bad economics. But they still had listeners. Whether you have X amount or XX amount, you can still have a profitable business with X amount of listeners. And it doesn't maybe have to be number 1, but you can still run a profitable business. And I just think that Air America just didn't have the left has never invested in radio. Even in political campaigns, they don't advertise on the radio, whereas the right wing does. God, I'm actually sort of lost my train here. But
well, there's a tremendous amount of corporate money that goes into they don't call it advertising, but advertising on National Public Radio, which certainly has a liberal orientation and a tremendous audience. So one answer to the age-old question of where is the left-leaning talk.
We don't consider the corporate underwriting for NPR liberal. I mean, we in Pacifica don't consider that liberal, quite frankly.
I think most Americans do, and so they think of that as the liberal talk radio. Just as most, many conservatives don't consider right-wing talk radio to be conservative. So you can get all twisted in definitions, but the fact is that there has never been a massively successful left corollary or equivalent to conservative talk radio in this country. Air America was an interesting experiment. I don't know of a single person who had a show on Air America who went on to a massively popular career in any other aspect of radio.
Well, Rachel Maddow, I mean, the biggest star on MSNBC.
She's a great example of someone who did extremely well on television and never really was big on radio. I don't know why that would be. She's obviously has the skills for it. But I think part of the reasoning is that the audience for the liberal audience, the audience that wants to hear about and talk about liberal approaches to or left approaches to issues, does not choose to do so on the radio. You can look at the ratings of MSNBC, never remotely as high as Fox, but nonetheless quite strong, and say there's obviously an audience there, but that audience has blossomed on television in a way that it never did on radio.
All right, thank you, Kim. Let me move to Anthony. Go on, Anthony.
Hello, Mark. I'm a program producer at KPFA in Berkeley, and I'd like to ask you, in light of all this history you've studied and recounted, what do you make of a couple of pieces of new conventional wisdom that I hear spoken among sometimes our board members and management? Conventional wisdom A, young people don't listen to radio. The conventional wisdom 2022 Part B, appointment listening is over. But what do you make of those two?
Okay, they're both really interesting. So young people don't listen to radio. That's simply not true. So they don't listen in the same numbers as previous generations did when they were in that age group, because they have a lot more options and they're spending enormous amounts of time online. But they are listening to stuff online. It may not be traditional broadcast radio stations, but they're listening to podcasts. They're listening to each other on various social media through the various chat functions, and those functions are blossoming at every turn. So if you define radio as audio, they're listening a ton. They're probably listening more than previous generations. They're not listening as much to AM, FM radio, but they are listening. They are actually listening to radio, and particularly to music on the radio, but it's a question of who you define as they. So the radio listeners, the traditional FM radio listening, it has now skews toward a lower economic demographic than it used to. So a lot of the higher end listening, as far as socioeconomic level, has migrated to podcasts and other online audio. And yet there's still a very large number of people, young people, who listen to traditional FM, mostly to music stations, in very much the way that they have for many years. The other shibboleth that you mentioned was young people, and what was the other one?
Appointment.
Appointment listening is done. I mean, that's kind of disturbing to me, because at least if a show is on at a given time, You could, obviously, if it's a call-in show, people can participate. And if somebody,
Right.
if somebody downloads it and listens at 11 a.m. and somebody else downloads it and it listens at 12:30 and someone else downloads
Right.
it, listens to it at 2, there's no community there, and it's completely one to many. It's no longer interactive.
To pose a very controversial analogy, I would analogize that shift, which I think is a permanent one, and there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. I would analogize that to what we've done to Election Day. We've taken Election Day and made it election couple of months. And obviously that has boosted participation, just as the change in appointment listening has boosted audience, but it has diminished community. So we no longer have that communal activity of going to the polls together, seeing our neighbors, seeing everyone participating in democracy at the same moment, seeing the advocates for one or another candidate or cause. We are losing that piece of tradition that I think played a very important binding role for us. We're gaining things by expanding Election Day as well. We're gaining participation, we're gaining flexibility, we're gaining the capacity of people who are working to vote on a different day or vote from home, or whatever it is. It's a trade-off. And similarly with appointment listening, by making our programming available to people whenever they want it, there's a bigger potential audience out there. There's a bigger real audience out there, but we're losing that community that we had when everybody could call in at the same moment, when everybody was listening at the same moment, when people, you could then have the water cooler effect where people at work or in their family or around the dining room table could debate each other and say, oh, that guy on that's a crazy guy on the radio, or why are you listening to her, or whatever it was that bonded us together and that created a more active, involved audience. We're losing that. So again, it's a trade-off. I think it's not a very good trade-off, but there are people who would make the opposite argument. They have good arguments. I do think there's no bringing that back, at least not in a mass way. I do think that it's possible, and there are people who do it, who have real followings, who want to be part of it live, just as they want to be part of a Facebook Live episode or this a Zoom like this. People could watch this later if you send it out by email, but it's not the same as being there when we're all here together. And people want that live experience, and they want it with the new technology, and they want it with the old technology. So it's up to the individual creators to send that message, to make that a big part of who we are and what our programming is, and say, you can listen anytime and it's going to be okay or good. But if you're here together with us, we can have an experience together and sell that. I think that's really crucial because I think there is an added benefit that no one can get by listening later.
So you think there's still a future for the nighttime talk show?
I think so, but like Kim was saying earlier, it could be a smaller audience and yet still be successful. In fact, could be more powerful.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Now we're going to sort of come to a close here. I might steal Mr. McClay's thunder because I'm going to want to ask Mark to perhaps put a policy hat on, a guru hat, and at some point opine about what he thinks we should do at Pacifica. But go on. I think you're going to ask the same question, Mr. McClay. Go on, Otis.
You have no idea. It has been a frightening day.
Okay, go on.
Was it Tuesday nights where you could walk through any town in America? There would be no one on the street, and all you would see in the windows as you passed the houses was the black and white television. Was that the night of I Love Lucy?
I just want to get your thoughts. You came as a young teenager to WBAI. I guess, 76 or so?
Right, 75, 76 in there.
Right.
Yep.
And so, you paid attention in your book to Pacifica. Now Pacifica, of course, is in a situation where it's lost about, I'd say, 2/3 to even more of its audience since 1999. The stations are basically have about 80 to 90,000 AQHs a week. And I think it's far lower than that because AQHs only are estimating tune-ins. So we're in a situation where the whole foundation and its signal and content has to be revolutionized and changed. And I was wondering, if you were in the position, what suggestions or ideas would you have that we should think about based on your looking at radio, FM radio historically? What do you think we should do as a foundation to move forward and turn the whole thing around? And Otis, I just wondered if you want to add to that. Bruce, no, we're just
No, I just absolutely, where does he think we're going? Not even Bruce? Only Pacifica, but what's happening in radio, and how can we somehow exploit it?
All right, Bruce, you want to jump in with something before we tune out here? Because I know Anita has to. I know Anita's trying to get in, but I couldn't be able to get her in. Go on, Bruce.
She says she's in the waiting room, but it's technologically challenged. I want to ask Mark if maybe going. Thanks for the book, by the way. I got halfway through it. It's really amazing. All the kids with the transistor radio under their pillow that became broadcasting hosts.
Yeah.
I want to ask you if you'd be willing to help us sort of put Pacifica back on the rails in terms of format. One of the things I noted throughout the half of the book that I read was every time you heard the word community, you heard the word success. And I think Pacifica has drifted away from that. I mean, if you read the stories about Bob Fass and the open door at midnight and people just coming in and out, and Alice's restaurant getting rehearsed until it was ready, over and over again, the words community. And if you look around at Pacifica today, the stations are kind of castles with the doors closed, the gates are closed, and there isn't that community. And BAI probably has more call-ins than the other stations, and those shows are actually very successful. As a matter of fact, if you want, take a look at David Rothenberg any Saturday, and he's very personable, and it's really a conversation, even though he doesn't take call-ins, but he's talking to his listeners. He's got very loyal listeners. So I'm hoping you'd be willing to take a look at the programming that we're doing and see what you would suggest to put the thing back on the rails. That's it. I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you, Bruce. And I must admit that one secret to Bob Fass was he would close the door and basically get stoned out of his mind. That was the real secret of Bob Fass. But Mark, we're sort of putting you on the spot as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a guru a la Pacifica and radio. So, but what thoughts do you have? I mean, what would you suggest? What do you think are ideas that come to mind in terms of what we should do going forward?
I mean, my recent exposure to Pacifica is primarily through WPFW in Washington and BAI in New York. And what I see in both of them, what I hear in both of them is a very disparate, just no clear direction. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you could go through the entire history of Pacifica and say it was never about direction. It was about lack of direction. It was about serving many different communities with many different voices. So if that's the goal, and I think that's always been the goal, then there's not going to be one answer. There's going to be several answers. Now, it's complicated by the fact that there are different answers generationally, and certainly in the case of PFW, you have two very different generations listening to that station. You have the older generation that sees it as a jazz station, and yeah, they do some talk stuff, but that's when I turn it off. And then you have the younger generation that's much more political, much more politically inclined and involved, that has very little patience for the jazz and wants the station to be very much connected with the activism in the city. And the station has tried for decades to be both things to both groups. And I think everyone would agree that has not worked. Except for the people, of course, who listen to it and like the shows that they like and only listen during those times that they like. And so they have become, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, appointment listeners. And they know when the jazz blocks are, and they know when the political blocks are, and they act accordingly. So that's not necessarily a recipe for failure. But I think it all boils down to quality. And we started our conversation waxing a bit nostalgic about Bob Fass and Steve Post and Larry Josephson and other highly creative, highly attractive voices who had something to say and an original and daring way of saying it. And that's the key to me. I make the pitch in the book for creating a new generation of creative voices. And I don't really care what they say. Somebody running a station may want to care what they say and may want to have to choose from a particular set of topics or approaches. But I think the overarching goal needs to be the best talent scouts and the best recruiters possible. And what happens to institutions like Pacifica is after decades, they get stuck because there are people who've been around for a long time who have a claim to a particular hour or a particular program, and they're kind of locked in, or it becomes a political battle. And we've all seen the internecine battles through the decades. And that's not unique to Pacifica. That happens in any institution that's been around for a while. And so you have this constant tension between those who had their place and maybe did well and for a time, and maybe their audience has moved on, or maybe their audience is still there, but the people who run the station want to open the door to new folks. And so it is time, I think, for it takes a lot of spine to do this. It takes a lot of guts to do this, to say, we're sunsetting. We had, this happens on newspaper op-ed pages all the time. We have columnists who've been around way too long, and they're there and they stay because they have their following and because they're already there. It's inertia. And every once in a while, you get an editor who comes along and says, just because you've been there doesn't mean you're going to be there. And they do a clean sweep and bring in new voices. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But man, I think it has to be done. And but it has to be done in concert with a really open, rigorous talent search, where you're not just looking to fill a box or to satisfy a particular community, but rather to say, who is going to be the most compelling, entertaining, important, knowledgeable, and thought-provoking voices that we can have on this station. And that requires leadership that is open to new stuff and has the gumption and the guts to say goodbye to what has been there for a long time, whether it's working or not, whether it has an audience or not.
Right. Very good. Let me just let Mo Thomas make the last comment. Mo, you're the chief engineer at PFW. Go on, Mo. You'll have the last word here with.
Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I'm in San Francisco today. And Mark, I've listened to you carefully for the last hour or so, and find it enlightening. I was part of everything you say, not as illustrious a career as yours, but I listened to Clear Channel AM back in the 60s. That I studied while listening. And I was involved in the FM growth in 69, 70 up in Pennsylvania at Juniata College, JC. And then we started a little 10 water in Merced, California. I'm a big advocate of small thing that NPR and the NAB have been fighting now for years, saying that it was going to have an adverse impact to their economic model. As you know, there was a study done that proved that that was categorically wrong, that low power FM had their niche audiences, but it had almost no effect on the established broadcasters, the large broadcasters. The other thing we learned was that having a big signal, a 50,000 watt or 100,000 watt in LA signal, was not necessarily a guarantor of success in the market, that you had to have content that people wanted to listen to. And it's something that I got shot for, frankly, in LA. Is the two times that I was IGM in LA, when I suggested that it had to do with content, not necessarily subject, that it had to do with presentation, that it had to do with preparation and research and listening to something that was actually interesting or informative. And the example I gave was Michelle Martin at NPR, who was also bounced off the air. But as you know, Michelle is extremely intelligent. By the way, she used to be a producer at Nightline. And Michelle would come on with her show, Tell Me More, and it was a terrific interview show and a terrific preparation. Margaret Prescott does somewhat the same. But we have had difficulty in Pacifica reproducing that it's been talked down as NPR light. And people just seem to be afraid of success. They just want to keep on doing what they've been doing, and so they become reactionaries. They are dug in. I've been doing this. I don't know how many times Michael Novick and I have heard the expression. I've been on the air with KPFK for 10, 15, 20 years, and I have an audience, and I'm entitled. I've heard the same thing in Washington. I've heard the same thing in Houston. And meanwhile, as you probably know, we are technologists. All we do is provide a technical platform such that these kinds of experiments that you talk about can go on. So in Washington, we're getting ready to put on HD radio. And we think it's going to work. First of all, Ubiquity will tell you that 35% of the dashboards in the major markets have HD radio. People don't even know where the button is to turn it on. The second is we don't promote HD radio very well. And I'm probably in a minority when I tell you that HD radio is another opportunity. It's an undiscovered country. We have in Washington, we know, a pent-up demand for full-time jazz station. Full-time jazz stations have proven to be not economically viable, at least in the Washington market. And we think HD2 with all jazz would work. We also know that people want innovative community radio, as you talk about, something we may or may not be able to do on the main channel, but we do have a place now where we can do some experimentation. And finally, we think we can offer the kids, that is, those that are taking RTV, either in high school or college, particularly college students, that produce these marvelously well-produced, well-researched podcasts. They turn it in for a grade, they get a letter grade, and it's never seen or heard from again. We think that's a rich mine of activity that could draw an audience. So those are just some examples of what I have about exactly what you're talking about, where the medium can go back to its roots, can go back to something interesting instead of searching for the dollar, the economic imperative, where, you know, the big money is where it's at. I used to listen to Air America, by the way, and I loved it. Some of the stuff was good. It wasn't uniform. Some of the stuff, you know. But it was wonderful if you wanted to listen to real progressive broadcasting. I don't know what happened to their business model, but they went down the toity. But Pacifica has become, again, an entrenched reactionary, if you will, conservative in the broadest sense of the term. In broadcasting, I think we can do better. And by the way, those who reach into their pockets to support us are looking for the very thing you're talking about, the experimentation, the innovation, the something interesting to listen to. And as it is with podcasts today, people don't stick in one spot. And so consequently, we don't get the benefit of the audience numbers that CPB is looking for. But I do think that there's an audience out there and it can be developed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mo. And let me just, Mark, you have any final comments? And first of all, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been really invaluable for all of us to hear your thoughts and comments about this. I'm sure we all, feel that way, and we'd love to hear you again sometime. But what's your last comments about all this?
Thanks very much. I really appreciate that, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Sounds like Mo has some really good ideas for PFW, and sounds like they're thinking out, in creative ways, and that's exciting. I have my doubts about the HD, the viability of HD, especially in a world where people are primarily using the internet in their cars. If HD channels are made easy to tune to in the car, then it's a real possibility. I would hate to see jazz taken off the main channel at PFW, but that's just my own personal taste. But I'm glad to hear that they're thinking in those creative ways, and glad that all of you overall are involved in this search for more compelling content, and that's what it's really all about. So I got to run, but thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you again, Mark, for spending time. We look forward to you taking this book and doing it again and updating it. Thank you so much.
Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say in every song. If it's true, that's where I belong. Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say